All right, party people. So we're going to have an A-Push Smarty Party covering topic 2.4, the transatlantic trade. So we're going to start with, and I'm going to try and just zoom in so you see the parts of the notes that you need. All right, so we're going to start with an Atlantic economy developed in which goods as well as enslaved Africans and American Indians were exchanged between Europe, Africa, and the Americas through extensive trade networks. European colonial economies focused on acquiring, producing, and exporting commodities that were valued in Europe and gaining new sources of labor. So really what they're talking about here first is the triangular trade. Okay. And so the triangular trade was a pretty complex system of trade between the colonies providing a variety of raw materials to England, which would then transform those into manufactured goods, which they would sell back to the colonies, or would be shipped to Africa and then traded to the slave traders in order to purchase slaves, which would then be transported along the Middle Passage to the New World. So this leg of the triangular trade is known as the Middle Passage. And it was the forced journey of kidnapped Africans who were going to be forced into slavery in the colonies. The journey was incredibly harsh. It was incredibly inhuman, and a lot of people who were on these boats did not survive. Right around 10% did not survive. The triangular trade network, the transatlantic trade, was making England incredibly wealthy, and they wanted to maintain that positive balance of trade under the economic system of mercantilism, which we've talked about in class. So mercantilism is the idea that the colonies are providing those raw materials, which again are then transformed into manufactured goods. England is exporting more than she's importing, therefore making more profit, and that profit or that wealth is the positive balance of trade. Now, to ensure that the colonies were following the rules of mercantilism, that they were doing what they were supposed to do, England passes a series of navigation acts, and there's a few of them. But essentially the navigation acts were laws that restricted colonial trade and that they were limited to trade with England only, regardless of whether or not there might have been another buyer who was willing to pay more for the raw materials. Legally, they were required to trade with England. Now, it didn't always happen that way. The colonies would sometimes smuggle their goods to other countries, and if England wasn't paying attention, then the colonies could make more money. But the most important part, the job of the colonies in all of this, and under mercantilism and under the Navigation Acts, is that they're providing these valuable raw materials. And under the Navigation Acts, they're providing these valuable raw materials at a cut rate price to England. All right, for Part B, it says by continuing trade with Europeans, increase the flow of goods in and out of American Indian communities, stimulating cultural and economic changes and spreading epidemic diseases that caused radical demographic shifts. So trade with Europeans increased the flow of goods in and out of American Indian communities. So the fur trade continues. And the fur trade is actually going to have some pretty significant environmental impacts. So in addition to it being the trade between the Europeans and the indigenous nations, the fur trade becomes so popular and they are hunting so many beavers that there's a destruction of the beaver population, which causes environmental damage and ecosystem problems in particularly the Great Lakes regions. And the fur was being traded for European goods, which were valuable. It might have been weapons, it might have been finished products, and these products and these trade networks are causing conflict between indigenous nations who are fighting with one another to control the colonial trade relationships. And an example of this would be the Beaver Wars. The Iroquois Confederation is going to go to war with neighboring indigenous nations to control the fur trade because it was so valuable, not only economically, but maintaining a relationship with the British was also a bit of defense and self-protection. Now, as we know from studying the Columbian Exchange, contact with Europeans often resulted in the spread of disease, and that was true for indigenous nations in North America, just as it was when the Spanish made contact in the Caribbean islands and then in later parts of Latin America. And so to give you some kind of, an idea, and smallpox was one of the diseases that was spread. This is a graph of the Huron Nation population. So in 1630, there were around 40,000 members, and 10 years later, they've lost over almost 3/4 of their population due to a variety of reasons, but largely due to disease. And so this disease, this European contact, is going to cause huge demographic shifts. For part C, we've got the British government increasingly attempted to incorporate its North American colonies into a coherent hierarchical and imperial structure in order to pursue mercantilist economic aims, but conflicts with colonists and American Indians led to erratic, and erratic means inconsistent enforcement of imperial policies. So first, let's look at the British government increasingly attempted to incorporate its North American colonies, and an example of an attempt at incorporation is something called the Dominion of New England. So the King James II, essentially revoked charters, primarily of New England colonies, and instead of them being individual colonies, lumped them into a single colony called the Dominion of New England. Now, the initial purpose was to increase defense because the French are just, are just right on the other side of the mountains, engaging in fur trade, and so the French and the English, having never liked one another, this is problematic in the eyes of the British. And additionally, the king was getting concerned about the increasingly independent ways of colonists, and so maybe by bringing them under this Dominion control, he might, put a stop to some of that. And ultimately, he wants to strengthen the colonial dependence on England. He wants them to be dependent in a way that they can't really survive without England. And so he sends a man by the name of Sir Edmund Andros, who is wholesale rejected by the colonists. Essentially, gets off the boat and almost has to immediately turn around and get back on the boat and go back to England. And the Dominion of New England is an extraordinary failure. So it doesn't last terribly long, and the individual colonies retain their identity. However, King James II does revoke the change Massachusetts charter so that they become a royal colony and therefore under a royal governor and a little bit more under his control than they previously were. And so after the failure of the Dominion of New England, they come to believe that perhaps that sort of strict enforcement of and that strict monitoring of relationships just isn't going to work for the colonies. And as long as we have them and Britain believed as long as they were economically tied to England, that economic dependence would strengthen ties. And so they really, at this point, limit their involvement in colonial government. So, that salutary neglect. So they're not enforcing laws, but they're also sort of turning a blind eye and giving passive permission for the colonial regions to develop their own governments. And so then the colonies develop relatively democratic governments for the time. We see the first colonial legislative assembly, which is the House of Burgesses in the Chesapeake region in New England. We see town meetings in the middle colonies. We see colonial assemblies as well, with varying requirements to participate in these different governmental bodies. So for the town meetings in New England, you needed to be male church member, House of Burgesses, you had to be a member of the wealthy elite and have a certain amount of property and that kind of stuff in order to be elected to this body. All right, so moving on to topic 2.5, interactions between Native Americans and Europeans. I've not broken down these subtopics in the same way as I normally do. Really what I'm going to be focusing on are first the alliances that existed, the conflicts, and then an example of accommodation by the Spanish. So I didn't quite break these subtopics down the same way. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about alliances, and there are two alliances that I want you to remember. The first is the covenant chain. And so the covenant chain was a series of alliances and agreements, primarily with the Iroquois Confederacy, between the Iroquois Confederacy and British colonists and British colonial governments. The Iroquois Confederacy was a powerful force on the frontier, and many Europeans, in fact, called them the Romans of the New World because they viewed the Confederacy as almost like an empire. So they're certainly, viewing it through their lens. And the covenant chain is really about survival for both the British and for the indigenous nations that are part of the Iroquois Confederacy. For the indigenous nations, they're looking for survival from the Europeans, like having a positive relationship and having the British somewhat dependent on them for something means that they are much more likely to survive. The British see it as survival from the French, who are an increasing presence in North America, and as the British colonial population grows, it is much more likely that the British and the French are going to come into conflict in North America. Now, the French had their own alliance. It was called the French-Huron Alliance. And initially, the French-Huron Alliance is stronger than the covenant chain because it had been in place longer, but ultimately the covenant chain is going, just because of size and scope and presence of the amount of British that are present, it's going to be a little bit stronger. So the alliances, it's almost like you have the British and the Iroquois Confederacy versus the French and the Huron. Now the conflicts, and of course, we've briefly mentioned settler colonialism, the idea that British colonists came with the intent of totally replacing the existing population. And the three conflicts I'm going to talk about are examples of tactics they used to do that. So the first, we've mentioned briefly with the southern colonies, and I've color-coded these based on this map here. So green being the Chesapeake and red being New England. I'm only going to talk about a Chesapeake and New England for the purposes of these notes. So we have the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in the Chesapeake, and the Jamestown colonists and the Powhatan Nation had lots of conflicts, but these wars really are marked as being between like the 1620s and 1640s. And they are a series of conflicts and wars over land, as almost all of them are. They're all about indigenous nations protecting their land and European colonists wanting to take the land and replace the indigenous population with European population, the hallmarks of settler colonialism. In New England, we have the Pequot War from 1636 to 1637, and it is sparked by the death of a colonist, and it leads to the genocide of over 600 Pequot. The indigenous survivors of the Pequot War, sold into slavery in Bermuda. The death of the colonists is the spark, but really the goal is, again, settler colonialism and acquiring more land and replacing the population on that land with colonists. And then the last one is King Philip or Metacom's War in 1676. It was a conflict over the Puritans' expansionist policies and expansionist practices in Massachusetts. It's incredibly bloody, and it is the last offensive by Native Americans in New England, meaning it is the last time that they will instigate the conflict in New England. And King Philip's war, Metacom's War, falls apart, and the indigenous nations will lose this war after King Philip is killed. And without his leadership, things kind of fall apart after that. And then the last part I was going to talk about Spanish accommodation. And so the Pueblo Revolt is the primary example of this. So the Pueblo Revolt was led by Pueblo leader Pope in 1680, which is the Pueblo lived in what is now modern-day New Mexico. The Pueblo suffered horrifically under the encomienda system, and they rejected forced conversion to Catholicism. In 1680, they launched a well-organized and coordinated attack that completely overwhelmed the Spanish, and they were able to maintain their independence after this revolt for 12 years until Pope's death. After Pope's death, the Spanish resume control, but instead of having like this harsh controlling system, they allow the Pueblo more freedom in religious practices, in spiritual and cultural things. Now there is still a lot of Spanish control, but it's much more there's more accommodation than there had been previously. And a pro tip for exams, so when you see Pueblo's revolt, almost always for multiple choice questions, they're asking you something about the impact of the Pueblo revolt, and if it's a short answer question, it's probably going to be comparing the accommodation of the Spanish with the settler colonialism of the English. All right, moving on to topic 2.5, which is slavery in the British colonies. So we're going to look at this in two ways. One, the prevalence and the existence throughout the colonies, and the emergence of codified racialized slavery. All right, so for part A, all British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade due to the abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods, as well as a shortage of indentured servants. So all 13 colonies allowed and practiced slavery to varying degrees. So why? The why is that first, there's a large amount of land to be cultivated, and there is a shortage of indentured servants. With the difficulty of getting indentured servants to come to the colonies, and after Bacon's Rebellion, which was a turning point for landowners, the landowners, the elite, the wealthy in the 13 colonies are going to turn to African slavery as their primary labor source. Slavery existed everywhere. It was in New England farms. It was in ports, in port cities throughout the North and the South. It was on plantations. And the majority of the Africans that were enslaved were brought to the British West Indies. That's where the majority were brought to work in the sugar plantations and work in the sugar trade. A smaller percentage came to the colonies to work in primarily the South, but again with a few in the North. So this map right here shows you just a population difference of how many enslaved men and women lived in the 13 colonies. The farther north you go, you tend to see fewer numbers, and as you go farther south, the highest being in Virginia, followed by South Carolina, both of those engaging in cash crop agriculture, tobacco in Virginia, and rice and indigo in South Carolina. South Carolina is going to model its plantation system on that of the West Indies, where they have very, very large numbers of enslaved laborers, which it mimics what was going on in the British West Indies. And as I was just talking about, the large number of enslaved laborers that are going to be brought to the South, again, Virginia and South Carolina being the two largest population centers. Eventually, the number of enslaved laborers in South Carolina will outnumber the white population in South Carolina. And then the different activities they were participating in the North, again, small family farms, Chesapeake tobacco, Lower South rice, indigo, and those plantations were modeled largely after the British West Indies. The British West Indies are also going to be influential in how slavery is codified or legalized in the 13 colonies. And so we're going to move on to the next subtopic. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new laws created a strict racial system that prohibited interracial relationships and defined the descendants of African American mothers as black and enslaved in perpetuity. So this is a broad timeline of African enslavement in the 13 colonies in 1619. The first Africans arrive in Jamestown. In 1636, the first American slave ship, the Desire, is built and launched from Massachusetts. In 1640, John Punch is sentenced by court to servitude for life, and he is the first documented slave for life. In 1641, Massachusetts is the first colony to legalize slavery. In 1663, Gloucester County, Virginia, the first documented slave rebellion takes place. The same year, Maryland legalizes slavery. And it is this system of laws that step by step take away human rights away from the enslaved and transform them from humans legally into something else. So the inhumanity becomes built into law, and the racism will justify that. So the first, or one of the model, I hate to use the word model, but the slave code that really inspires a lot of the slave codes that are going to be passed in the 13 colonies is the Barbados Slave Code. And it is a law that removed rights granted under English law. So any English citizen had rights under the English Bill of Rights. And the Barbados Slave Code removed rights of Africans under English law and further protected white enslavers from legal consequences of rape, of murder, of torture, of assault. And it sets the example for how to codify race-based slavery. And Virginia and Maryland will use those to create, again, a series of laws that establish slavery as being based on race, as being passed from the mother to the child, as being lifetime, in perpetuity, refusing human rights like marriage, education, right to life, safety, family, all of those things. And we're going to look at some of these in more detail in class, but I did want to share a few with you here just to give you some examples. And if you look at them just, one after another, and it's not a single law that took away all rights and changed the status overnight. It was a series of laws that were created in response to issues that popped up throughout the colonies, and we'll talk about someone, particularly a woman named Elizabeth Key, as an example of that. All right, and so the last subtopic under 2.5 is Africans develop both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing aspects of slavery and maintain their family and gender systems, culture, and religion. So overt resistance looked like rebellion. So we have the New York City uprising in 1712, which was a revolt against the increasing number of rights that were being taken away. So every new law that was passed, a new right was taken away, and so there's an uprising against that. And then in South Carolina, you have the Stono Rebellion, the largest slave rebellion in South Carolina. Over 50 enslaved men and women escape as they are attempting to escape to Spanish Florida, where there is a promise of freedom. They are hunted and tracked down, and in an effort to stay free, they fight back, they defend themselves, and kill 25 whites. The result of both of these, or any other rebellion that would happen, is this increased fear among the white population that these slave revolts and these slave rebellions would happen and cause, death and destruction in the white community. So in response to that, or to try and control that, they would pass increasingly harsh slave codes. Covertly, you would see breaking of tools, escaping, slowing work pace, mimicking illness, and of course, as I mentioned in the an earlier video, the they maintained family structure. They provided surrogate family structures when families were torn apart. Language and music. So the Gullah in South Carolina, they have developed that Creole language. Food, religion, the blending of traditional African practices, spiritual practices with Christianity, giving us things like voodoo and Santeria. So, highly inventive, highly creative ways of surviving an inhuman situation. All right, so this is going to be our last topic, and this is topic 2.6, colonial society and culture. I did make one change to your vocab. I took out liberalism and added pluralism. So for subtopic A, the presence of different European religious and ethnic groups contributed to a significant degree of pluralism and intellectual exchange, which were later enhanced by the First Great Awakening and the spread of the Enlightenment. So we're first going to look at the different religious and ethnic groups, then we'll talk about pluralism and intellectual exchange, and then the First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. Okay, so ethnic groups, as you can see in this map, there's a pretty diverse spread of ethnic groups in the 13 colonies, ranging from the Dutch, Swedish, German, Scots, Irish, Scots, and Welsh. Of course, the Scots, Irish, and the Welsh we think of being a part of the United Kingdom, so it kind of makes sense that they're coming over. We also have the growth of the African population as a result, and the growth of the institution of slavery, which we just talked about a moment ago. So we have, a growing diversity within the 13 colonies. So in addition to ethnic diversity, we have quite a bit of religious diversity. You can see, looking at this map, primarily in the New England colonies, we have the congregational, which is what Puritan becomes. It becomes congregational. We have Lutheran, and you see that in the Mid-Atlantic colonies, which makes sense as you have a lot of Germans and Dutch coming into that area. Anglican, the South is heavily Anglican, and really aligning themselves religiously, socially with English social customs. Presbyterian. We also see the Reformed churches, and we see some Baptist, Roman Catholic, and Jewish. So if you look at the key here, you can kind of get a sense of the religious diversity. Well, all of this diversity, and again, it's not as diverse as we would say it is now, but for the time that was fairly diverse in terms of the amount of interaction you're having with people of different religions and from different countries. And so all of this diversity leads to an idea called pluralism. And pluralism is really just what happens when multiple groups are living together. And because they have different backgrounds and different experiences, they are sharing their ideas and their culture. So we have these intellectual exchanges. So really that's all that is getting at in the subtopic, is that because there is this diversity, we have pluralism, and these groups are starting to share ideas, and there's some blending of culture that's happening. And these intellectual exchanges are going to be enhanced as ideas come across the Atlantic and spread throughout all of the colonial regions. And one of these is going to be the First Great Awakening, which happened in the 1730s and 1740s, and it's a religious revival. We think of the New England colonies and part of the Mid-Atlantic as being founded for religious reasons. And early on, certainly religion was very, very important. But by the 1730s, we're almost 100 years into the colonial period, and 100 years after the founding of places like Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so while ancestors might have been super hyper religious, maybe 100 years later, 2 or 3 generations down, we're not as religious as we once were. So church membership has declined, and the First Great Awakening is an attempt to renew religious dedication. And so we see a renewal of religious devotion, and this is done through a series of revivals, like outdoor tent revivals and sermons. And these revivals and sermons were very intense emotional experiences, where they are focusing on like an individual's piety, an individual's ability, and their own faith is what's going to save them. It's no longer dictated by the pastor or the priest or whoever is in charge of the church. So the First Great Awakening leads to this idea that, you alone can be responsible for your faith and your salvation. And this idea catches on also because it's kind of happening simultaneously with the Enlightenment, which also has like an individual responsibility component. And two things come out of this First Great Awakening, which are going to lead up to the American Revolution. The first is that the First Great Awakening is a unifying colonial experience. So regardless of where you were from, if you were from Massachusetts, or if you were from Georgia, or if you had just arrived in the 13 colonies and had heard about this, it was something that I don't know if you just heard my dog, she was really shaking her ears. It is an experience that everyone can talk about. So you can meet someone and have a conversation with them, even though maybe you've never met them before. All of a sudden, all of the colonial regions have something in common where they had been very distinct and very different. We have this unifying experience. On top of the First Great Awakening, we're also experiencing the Enlightenment. And to a degree, the First Great Awakening is a little bit of a reaction to the sort of DSV of the Enlightenment. So hopefully this is just a review from last year, but we'll get into it a little bit more in class. So the Enlightenment is a much longer period, mid to late 1600s, going all the way up through about 1800. It's an age of logic and reason that had been inspired by the scientific revolution, using the scientific processes of observation and experimentation to make sense of the world. And so we see out of the Enlightenment, they're applying the scientific process to social processes like government and human rights, or what we would call human rights, but natural rights. They're questioning the role of government. They are questioning the relationship between citizens and their government, and they are certainly questioning divine authority. And so this period of questioning and logic and reason it has a lot of different philosophers. We're going to highlight just a few of them. The first one is John Locke, who is social contract, natural rights, consent of the governed. We have Montesquieu, and Montesquieu, if you clap it out, 3 syllables, Montesquieu, and he proposes the separation of power, or the 3 branches. So 3 syllables, 3 branches. And Voltaire, who is an advocate for the separation of church and state, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that kind of thing. And moving on to subtopic B, the British colonies experience a gradual Anglicization. And by Anglicization, what they mean is people are adopting more and more English culture, English language, English tradition, English products. Everyone, despite where they're from, is just becoming a little bit more English. And as they are becoming more anglicized, they are developing political communities based on English tradition, and this is just fostered by the emergence of a transatlantic print culture that we're reading in English and speaking English. So again, Anglicization is the growing use of British culture and norms, and then the colonial governments are based on the English model. So example, the colonial assemblies are modeled on Parliament, the British Parliament, so like the House of Burgesses, the legislative assemblies in the mid-Atlantic colonies. And they are also modeled on a political idea known as republicanism. And republicanism, like there's the Republican Party, and then there's the idea of a republic, and then there's the political idea of republicanism, not to make things too confusing. But republicanism, the ism, is putting personal interest aside and in favor of the common good. So like what I personally and selfishly want is not as what is important for the whole. The good of the many outweighs the good of the few, and we make good, honest choices for the community, for the good of the many. And so ideally, this English model based on Parliament should be based on the idea of republicanism, that we're not serving our selfish interests. However, it didn't always go down like that, as we know. We also see English culture spreading through the print culture, the newspapers, the books, all printed in English, which is the common language that everyone in the colonies is speaking. And trade also brings increased demand for British goods. Like the way you showed your wealth was by buying fancy, expensive British products.